It is great to have you all on this webinar. We're very excited to be here. My name is Jose Emanuel Alfaro Flores, Barahona Sanchez Valladares, or Jose Alfaro for short, and I use he, him, il pronouns. I'm the Director of Latinx Leadership and Community Engagement at Everytown for Gun Safety. These are some of our panelists that we're really excited to share with you today, all of their experiences in gun violence and gun violence prevention movement from across the United States. And we're gonna allow them to introduce themselves in a little bit. But first and foremost, I wanna ground us, right? You know, Latinx communities have been impacted by gun violence for generations, whether it's here in the United States, in some of our inner cities and across suburbs and rural communities, or in our home countries and on the trek through the Americas into the United States in search for a better life. Most recently, the Uvalde tragedy in Uvalde, Texas, has ignited a conversation and a need for Latinx communities to be a part of the gun violence prevention movement conversation. And oftentimes, our communities aren't always at the front lines, or rather aren't always at the table when these conversations are happening and arising. And so today we're going to be hearing from some of the folks who have been doing this work for a long time, who are grounded in their communities, and who are advocates, organizers, leaders, and people who are doing the work for our communities in order to keep our folks safe. I'll give you a couple of stats really quickly. We have almost 500,000 or about 5,000 Latinx folks die a year. Now that's about 1,300 every month. It's about 13 folks per day. And the majority of those are gun homicides. But that also doesn't necessarily include our undocumented communities, which are oftentimes left out of the data. It also doesn't include the underreporting that goes on from our law enforcement or in hospitals. And so there's a real need for data in our communities to be able to get a real sense of what gun violence looks like and its impact on our communities. Most recently, we also started having a transnational conversation about the influx of guns from the United States into Latin America, specifically into Mexico, that then find their ways into other parts of Latin America and in the Caribbean as well. Now, this is due to lax gun laws in some of these states that allow for straw purchases and allow for there to be gun trafficking without consequence. And so you're going to hear again from some of these really amazing folks. And I'm just going to go around and ask folks to introduce themselves. We'll start with Kim, then we'll go to Berto, Michelle, and Cuco.
Thanks, Jose. And hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Marisa Gutierrez Perez Morelos. And I am, my pronouns are she, hers, ella. I am the Director of State Programs with Community Justice. Community Justice is a state-based and national organization that is focused on and has been focused on for 8 years now. We're coming up on our 8-year anniversary on gun violence as it pertains to and affects disproportionately impacted communities that are my community, Brown community, and Black communities. This is very near and dear and central to why we were founded, what our continued focus is. And on top of that being our central focus, the way that we do our work is always alongside those disproportionately impacted, so centering survivors in the Black and Brown communities. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit more about what that's looked like over the past couple of years. But a little bit about me, I come from an organizing background. I was an organizer in DC before I joined this movement for gun violence prevention. I, in my life, saw too many people in my circle and my loved ones die. And I saw the way that our communities, mine being rural immigrant farm worker communities, tend to be forced into resilience about the death that we often see. And so I am super proud to be a part of this space and this movement now that is enriched with all of these Black and Brown faces and leaders that have been on the front lines of peacekeeping across our community, because we don't have to force resilience, right, in order to keep our community safe. And so excited to talk more about that, but that's a little bit about me. Jose, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, we'll pass it over to Berto.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. My full name is Berto Aguayo Contreras Flores, and I am here representing Increase the Peace. Increase the Peace is an organization that I founded back in 2016. We're based out of the south side of Chicago, more specifically the Back of the Yards neighborhood. And really what we do is try to, as our name implies, increase the peace really through developing young leaders and promoting peace through leadership development and community organizing. In the city of Chicago, if you look at the top 10 neighborhoods that have traditionally faced most of the gun violence, because we live in a very segregated city and the gun violence is really concentrated in just a few neighborhoods. We have 77 neighborhoods, but 10 of the neighborhoods face the brunt of the gun violence. You look at those top 10 neighborhoods, they also are the same neighborhoods with the highest levels of young people between the ages of 16 to 24 that are unemployed and out of school. And so, and that's actually partly what brought me into this work. I got an opportunity to work at a local elected official's office that changed my life. I was previously in a gang, and my high school principal, determined to not lose another student to the streets, said, "Hey, I want to connect you to a job opportunity. You need to be doing something better with your life." And that job opportunity completely changed the trajectory, not only of my life, but also, now my communities, because when I graduated college, I was determined to replicate the same job opportunities that were critical to transforming my own life and making sure that other young people in my community had that. And so since 2016, we've trained and connected to job opportunities about 700 young people. And so 700 young people have gone through our community organizing training. 700 young people have been connected to a job opportunity. Some of them now are older, and now one of them is serving on city council. Others have founded their own nonprofits. And so it's become really a network of peace leaders in the city. And just happy to really be here with all these amazing folks.
Thank you, Berto. Michelle?
Hey everyone, my name is Michelle Monterosa, she, her, ella pronouns. I am the surviving sister of my brother, Sean Monterosa, who was killed June 2nd of 2020 during the George Floyd uprisings in Vallejo, California by an officer named Jarrett Ton. And that's what brings me to this space and this work. I'm working at the intersection of police violence and also reclaiming a narrative for families impacted by police violence. Oftentimes our stories have been left out, and for many generations we've been just what the media says, what the numbers show on TV, and the horrific tragedies that we go through. And it's been 4 years, and our brother's anniversary is going to be just in 3 days, I believe. So the emotions are very high. But it's been 4 years of transforming my pain, my sister and I's pain, into power and purpose. And our brothers are why, but we recognize that Sean is just a small piece to this fight. There are many Latinos who are not accounted for. We are not being represented when we also experience this type of violence. So we just launched the Sean Monterosa project, where we're creating multifaceted initiatives to reclaim the narrative around police violence, but also while we elevate the life and legacy of our brother. For us, it's been so important to highlight who are our loved ones before just we hear about tragic incidents that happen. And here in San Francisco, we've been able to accomplish some beautiful things, being born and raised here, and having a commemorative plaque now being recognized by the city of San Francisco, the first person to be recognized that from this incident of losing our brother the way we did, that the city is honoring him with a plaque in our neighborhood where we grew up. And also for us, it's been reclaiming our stories through art. Our brother was an artist, graffiti writer, and we have a now permanent mural in San Francisco in the Mission District, which is predominantly Latino, where it tells the story of who Sean was, not just because of the tragic incident that took his life, but who was he before then? What were the programs that he was involved in? And, you know, that's what brings me to this work, and really centering the stories and finding healing through this work and why we reclaim our narrative, because this work isn't easy, but you know, it takes a lot for us to do this. But like Jose said in the beginning, if there's no tables for us, then we create our tables and reclaim our own narratives. And I'm just honored and grateful to be here, and you know, bringing our ancestors and our loved ones to this space also. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And Cuco.
Buenas tardes. My name is, I guess we're going with full name, so it's Refugio Rodriguez Iñiguez. I'm Rodriguez twice, and no, my parents were not related, different Rodriguezes. So, but it's also important for me to honor both of my names, because that's kind of part of our tradition, and it's honoring, you know, my lineage and my ancestors, and I really appreciate sharing the space, especially with the focus that we have. I think that that's important. You know, I truly feel that I'm here not because of any other reason other than, you know, my ancestors really prayed a great deal so that I would be afforded the opportunities to do what I do in terms of this work. So it's an honor to do the work. It's also a responsibility, because it's just not me. It's an extension of those ancestors, and more importantly, you know, I want to recognize that, because I think sometimes we find ourselves in spaces where we have to rely on that connection to our ancestors to help us and to support us, because we're made to feel like, you know, we don't belong, or we're the only one there, and we begin to second guess ourselves. And to me, it's that connection that is I think has helped me a great deal in those times when I really need it. It's an honor to be here. I work in terms of, you know, in terms of who I am. I'm a father of two. Been married for 28 years to a wonderful partner, Nelda Olvera Rodriguez, and I have two wonderful kids that call me their father. And that's really, to me, the title that I hold and who I belong to. In terms of what I do, I'm fortunate that I get to do this work and try to support communities in decreasing gun violence. I'm the strategist and the equity officer for the Hope and Heal Fund. Our focus is here in California to support organizations and develop strategies to decrease homicides and suicides across the state of California, including police violence. So everything that entails. And a lot of that is focused on my community and other communities of color, but it also includes white communities too, people that are also affected by gun violence. And I think that's important, because I think sometimes people feel that we're only out here to support our community. You know, I really care about all human life, and I think that every life is valuable, and we need to treat it as such and as a priority. So for us, a lot of our work encompasses partnering with a lot of these communities that are affected by gun violence differently. At the end of the day, there is no community that is immune to this anymore. I think, like many of you here and like many of those listening, you know, I've been affected by gun violence since I was very young, in terms of, you know, homicides, but also suicides in my community and my own family. You know, people who have been victimizers of gun violence and been victimized, myself included. I've been on both sides of that as well. So, you know, I feel very fortunate, feel very honored that I get to do this work, and really happy to be here with everybody. Gracias.
Thank you all. So as you all have heard, you know, I think oftentimes when we think about gun violence, or when we hear gun violence, especially in the mainstream, it's often thought about in terms of mass shootings, school shootings. And we wanted to make sure that we were exemplifying some of the diversity of what gun violence means and looks like, whether it's police violence, gun suicide, femicide. All of these forms of gun violence impact our communities. And for a lot of us, I think we have been desensitized, especially in communities of color, have been desensitized to the everyday gun violence that we experience in our home communities. And so we want to both emphasize that gun violence takes many different forms, and also that our communities have been disproportionately impacted by gun violence and its effects for a really long time. And it's time for us to really call that in and find ways of healing. And I'm hoping that we can share a little bit of that as well. So first, I will start with Kim. Now, Kim, you've been at Community Justice for a little over 2 years, and you've been engaging around, community violence intervention and interruption. One, can you share a little bit more about what violence intervention and interruption is? But then two, what are some of the things that you've seen or struggles that you've seen in Latina communities?
Absolutely. Thank you. Call me out. Tell me. It's 2 years going on 10 years, really. But and thank you for the question. So the part of what I'm going to be very honest here. I'm struggling because when I joined the team, I learned, like I said, I saw there were leaders, ancestors, folks that have been on the front lines of peacekeeping in our communities for decades. And I was so ready to jump on board and do anything and everything that it needs to be done to protect the work that they're doing. And that is very central to the work that we do at Community Justice in our state campaigns and how we organize. However, the peacekeeping work, or what is now the sexy new term that is community violence intervention, has taken many names before, what we now know as CVI. And I learned that it is part of a whole ecosystem of public safety in our communities. And so what I'm struggling with and what I'm trying to tease out in this panel and in response to your question is that community violence intervention is what we call the strategies for peacekeeping in our communities, and is the work that has existed in our communities for decades. And a lot of the work that I'm doing now in this narrative shifting is making sure that when we're talking to folks, when we're engaging folks on the front lines that are peacekeepers, when we are engaging elected officials that are deciding on whether or not they're funding this and why they need to be funding this and protecting this work, it is part of a larger ecosystem. It is part of the public safety ecosystem that we're building. And so CVI, to your question, is the strategy. It's taken many names, but I think the real work and is the challenge that I'm reflecting on and embarking on in my team and across the movement is making sure that we know about and are keeping our eye on the ball when it comes to building a public safety ecosystem. And to me, that's really started with using my organizing background and doing some really deep listening. The first couple of months to year till still, when we're designing a state campaign or a city-based campaign that is focused on supporting and uplifting funding for community violence intervention strategies, it also comes hand in hand with asking and vision setting with the folks on the ground for what is their vision for public safety? What does safety mean to them? And then designing from the ground up what's missing in that picture and what does every other facet of our government and our community need to do to make that a reality. And so it answers your question, but it also raises more questions for me in terms of the work that we have to do and that is left ahead of us in terms of bringing our community along when it comes to vision setting. What does safety mean to us and for us? And what would it mean to co-create that together? Because there are clearly pieces in our government and in our history that are historically racist and built to push us out that we need to address. But it also needs like a bigger framework, right? Is the framework for public safety. So what are we doing to keep our communities, to steal from what our partners at Cities United say, to keep our communities safe, hopeful, and healthy? What does that look like? And so while our campaigns really focus on protecting those funds and protecting the infrastructure to continue the peace building strategies that are CVI, our work ahead is really about that vision setting and how are we holding stakeholders, governments, elected officials, folks in public safety, folks in the healthcare system accountable to creating our vision of safety.
Thank you, Kim. So I think, I'll go to you next, Kuko, and I think this kind of goes hand in hand in a lot of ways. Hope and Heal Fund has now hosted its first ever inaugural gun violence convening for Latinx communities. Can you talk a little bit more about, what that convening, what came out of that convening, but then also why it was important and so monumental for our communities?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful thing to celebrate that it was held, but it's also a very sad statement in terms of that what we looked at was that there had never really been a national convening for Latinos focused on gun violence. Not to say that we hadn't talked about the issue, but really a space for ourselves to, as I like to put it, just to be ourselves, right? And I think you attended, as well as Michelle, I think, and Kim, I think, one of the observations that kind of set me back a little bit was that we didn't even know how to act like ourselves, because we've never had that like space. It was, and the way that I guess akin it to is the way that we como convivimos with each other, let's say at a quinceañera or at a wedding. We were still very white. Like, we showed up and did the thing, and we couldn't really. It took like a day for people to just kind of realize, like, oh wow, like this is actually our space, which was the intention. But I think so. I say that because I think that the need for space for us to show up in our full selves in terms of who we are around language, around differences. I mean, I'm a Chicano, there was Latinos, there was Hispanos, there was like everybody, Latinx, everybody calls themselves. So even that, but I mean, to create a space so we can even have that conversation, just to create space where we can be ourselves. But more importantly, in terms of content, to also talk about those things that are very particular to our communities. And I made a point during the conference to highlight that I really appreciate the shift in philanthropy and human services and the work that we do, towards really bringing us together around intersectionality. And I think that's wonderful. However, that doesn't speak to the issue of solidarity, because intersectionality speaks to, well, this is our collective kind of points of intersection, and that's wonderful. We should convene around those things. But we should also support each other in those things that don't affect us, but might affect our partner agencies or our other hermanos and hermanas from different communities. And for us, in particularly, the most obvious things are language and immigration status. And as you pointed out earlier, the way that our communities are affected in our home countries. Those are not issues that other communities might struggle with. And for us, it's really important because typically in the larger gun violence conversations nationally, those are not the things that get discussed. Certainly not language. This has primarily been, conducted a conversation in Spanish. Our communities and other immigrant communities are not included. So I think creating those spaces is really important. I think for our own well-being and our own healing and our own convivencia in terms of being ourselves, because I think that we do things a little bit different. I mean, a lot of us open this with really a recognition of our ancestry, and not just who we are in terms of historically, but really our spiritual connection to communities, and I think that some of those things, we need that space for ourselves to highlight some of those nuances that are very particular to our community, but also to have hard conversations about ourselves. From an equity standpoint, when I used to teach, one phase of my life I was teaching, I thought it was going to be teaching, but I used to tell people, it's not always about Whitey and what Whitey did to us. Like, at this point, let's talk about what we're doing to ourselves, because the internalization of things is really, really critical. And I think gun violence is one of those issues that we really have to focus on, because at this point, it is, it's not white racist organizations or the KKK coming to harm our communities. They don't have to do that. We harmed ourselves now. It's lateral violence. It's the internalization of oppression. And again, no community, I think, in this country would be in the same place if they had suffered 500 years of the oppressive everything that has occurred to us. And as a consequence, the internalization of a lot of this is really what we're seeing in our communities. And I think that's important to highlight, because that's an internal conversation that we have to have within ourselves. And sometimes we don't have those spaces, or we have to create opportunities for that conversation where it's all inclusive. And again, I'm not trying to say we don't want to be sensitive to the needs of other people, but the issue with racism is that it tailors itself to each individual community, and it tailors itself to its differences. And as a consequence, I think that we need those spaces so that we can explore out and address some of these things that we're dealing with internally, kind of an in-house or in-group conversation. And again, not to exclude other people, but really to create an agenda and a focus that is very particular to our reality, just like other communities have an opportunity to do so. So for us, I think that you know, the biggest takeaway I think from this convening was that we need to do that more, and more importantly, that there's a considerable amount of decolonization that has to occur in practice. We're very good at articulating it, but in practice, when we don't even know how to act like ourselves in a convening, I think it speaks to a lot of that, and I think that that's an important aspect of it. So. I think for me, that's probably the biggest takeaway is that whenever possible, let's try to create some spaces, again, not just for the sake of having a meeting space for Latinos or Chicanos or Hispanos, but really having a meaningful space where we are also going to delve deep into our own internalization and how, you know, things like colorism, you know, that exists in our community, sexism, everything that's embedded in our community, anti-Blackness that's in our communities, that we haven't really had a conversation about, that we need to if we're going to continue to do this work. So, but thank you.
I appreciate you, Kuko. And I think, you know, when we talk about some of these components, I think we're also talking about the healing journey that comes along with, you know, reckoning with that internalization or the impact of all of these systems that we've had to navigate. And I think with that, the through line there that comes to mind for me is, you know, your own healing journey and story, Michelle. Now, you know, your brother's story has been one that has touched me personally as somebody who, you know, grew up in a very similar community. I see so much of myself in your brother. And when I learned about his story and when I, you know, learned more about your struggles, I really felt connected to that work in a way that I think oftentimes our communities don't necessarily feel as connected when we think about police violence, right? And so I'm curious for you, you know, what are some of why is it important for Latina communities to engage in this fight? And what is some of the advice that you have for our folks who want to get more involved, but may not necessarily see themselves in this particular part of the movement?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's been 4 years. It's been 4 years of navigating many systems. You know, one being from the Bay Area, you hear about stories when they come from big cities. You know, what happened to Sean happened in Vallejo, California, which is not far from San Francisco, maybe about an hour away. And I say this to say, it takes a lot of work and sacrifice. It takes a lot of sacrifice of your own healing, you know, even operating from feeling, if I don't do this, then who? You know, and that's where me and my sister doing this work, I'm fortunate enough that I have her, you know, June 2nd's every day for us, but it's just a matter of how do we transform our pain and turn it into power and purpose. And, you know, Sean being our why, our beacon, and giving us hope that, you know, the work we're doing will help prevent another Sean. And it's been 4 years, and it's been 4 years since this department that's gone away with killing people from 2012. There's been 20 people each year that this police department has harmed. Then they haven't killed somebody since Sean. And I say this to say because it's so important for us to be involved in this fight. And there's moments when we feel hopeless, like why? You know, the police have so much power, the police unions have so much power. Maybe our voices are going to be heard. You know, there's so many different tactics and approaches to fight the system, right? But also figuring out ways where we can figure out, one, bring our lived experience and our stories, but also humanizing our loved ones. And I think for us and what we've learned, and through the humanization of who Sean was and the collective power and work what we've done in the community of Vallejo with the families, it's a testament to say now, and you know, we shouldn't thank fish for swimming, but it's been 4 years that this department that's gotten away with murdering people and celebrating, you know, about after they kill somebody, they celebrate with a barbecue and bend their badges. This is not rumors. This is leaked out. And it goes to say that, you know, at the end of the day, we have to be involved. There's no way of, you know, many times we hear in our comunidades where you just put your head down, you do the work, you just, you know, you cope whatever way, you know, these are outdated coping mechanisms that we have, right? Like you see my sister and I do this work, and my parents are, you know, they immigrated to this country. My parents speak a little bit of English, but not much, right? So even language approach, right? Having access to language, and it's really hard, but you know, again, it's just a matter of preventing what happened to Sean to happen to somebody else. And it's been challenges. And you know, for us, the most important thing is just, again, the humanization and just having the courage to sit down and have conversations. The hardest thing was, I would say, in my brother's 2-year anniversary, sitting down with the chief of police and being, we've done everything we can, what can you do? And you know, just even showing up in the conversation and being like humanizing each other, you know, learning that this man speaks fluent Spanish, played pro basketball in Morelia, Mexico, you know, and to hear our story and hear what we're pleading for, right? And he also doing the work of wanting to prevent what happened to Sean. It took a lot of courage, and it wasn't easy, and it was the day-to-day work that we had to do, and the community support at large behind us. We could not do this without community support. And I say that to say, like, when our people, our gente, those who are on this call, like, how do we support families affected by police violence, Latino families affected by police violence? Just show up with love and humility. Those are the biggest two things I can tell you. It could be anybody. And, you know, as Cuco said, gun violence, police violence, all types of violences, it's not a situation where it's not going to come knocking at your door one day, you know. And I think it's one of those things, even talking within our comunidades, of how many of us have heard, if you don't, si no se comportan, if you don't behave, voy a llamar a la policía. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, has, right? And that's traumatizing. But knowing that that comes from just a mindset of just trying to assimilate to being here in this country, and it's just so, it can be devastating, and not noticing that one day a police officer who may not have had the proper trainings or stuff, right, can actually just come and unfortunately murder your loved one in front of you. And then that opens a can of worms of just so much trauma and pain that we want to prevent. So my just advice to folks who wanted to get involved, or how can you get involved, is, you know, show up and ask questions. Ask the family, do you need a meal? You know, half the times when you lose your loved ones, you don't even think about eating, and let alone navigating state-sponsored violence is very, very hard. There are limited resources. There little to none. Victims compensation, those are many barriers that oftentimes Black and brown communities, we're not even given them. We don't even qualify. When we need to get reports given to us, most of the times they're given, we have to go get them by the person who caused harm to us. So it's just even things like that. But I know I kind of ranted off, but some challenges is just, to keep it a buck, it's just lack of resources, capacity. It's luckily I speak 2 languages, you know, even having to translate, and you know, making sure there is no blueprint for this. And my sister and I have been thinking very deeply about how do we engage Latino families. And for us, it's been so important with having a mural of our brother in the Latino community in the Mission District in San Francisco that tells a story. Who's this kid who just cut out, you know, this big mural here in the Mission District? If you've been in San Francisco, you know this district's predominantly very bright of murals, just like in Chicago, y'all have murals. But, you know, it paints the story of, like, yes, you see Sean, but it tells, coming from our parents immigrating to this country, being a young man, learning to play with, being a graffiti writer, being in various nonprofits, working on cars, to the night where, you know, we all saw what it was to be in the pandemic and saw the injustice of George Floyd. And knowing that, coming from cities like San Francisco, it happens to us. We're not, Latinos being killed by police, it's not just something that just came out the bloom, right? In San Francisco, even prior to my brother, it was Alex Nieto who was killed at Bernal Heights for just having a burrito in his hands. And it you know, it was death by gentrification. And Abraham Toledo a few years ago, right? And it just goes to show again and again, it shouldn't be at the expense of the families to do the work to amplify these stories. Obviously, it's work we have to do, but I think there's collective power in many people coming together to help amplify these stories because, again, we're not a monolith, but these issues do happen to us as well, and there's lack of data as well. We're not properly categorized. There's only a black or white bubble that when there's the coroner report, that's the only thing they highlight. So again, even our even own data is not even properly categorized. And there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of challenges, but you know what? If it's me and my sister always say, if we don't do the work, then who? But there's been so much collective power and building with so many people on this call. And my just advice to everyone is to not wait till it happens to your own loved one to get involved in this fight, but also the same work that's happened in the GVP space, it's the same work we can learn from one another. How do we bring these same mandates onto police? How do we, there's already blueprints out there. It's just a matter of working collectively together to, again, not have another Sean happen, not have another Adam happen, not have another Alex Nieto happen.
Absolutely. Thank you. This also brings me to you, Berto. I think your work kind of stands at this intersection of, keeping our community safe while also recognizing that, there needs to be peace building, both in community and among communities. And your model, I think, similar to what Kim was saying, is very intersectional, whether you think about youth development work to mutual aid, immigration rights services, food access, thinking about Black and Brown unity. Why this particular model, and how does that impact Latinx communities, and why is it that these models should be as intersectional as they are when we're talking about our communities?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Jose, and Michelle, Kim, and Kuko. I'm always reminded when I'm in these panels, like, a lot, like y'all are my personal heroes kind of thing. Like it's an honor to be, and I tell this to Jose all the time when I see him, like it's beautiful to see people from all parts of the country coming together. It's kind of like the Avengers, Avengers assemble. So just honored to be here, really. And to answer your question, Jose, I think one way that I think about it is by comparing gun violence, the epidemic of gun violence, to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Because in my frame of reference, they're both diseases, right? And just starting with definitions, what's a disease? One definition is a particular quality, habit, or disposition regarded as adversely affecting a person or group of people. And we saw that both with both diseases. And so in the same way that the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated and exposed already existing inequalities, that's the same thing that gun violence has done in the city of Chicago. And if you were to look at a map, right, like I said earlier, the reason why we do youth development work, food access work, is because we recognize that our communities are so under-resourced that that in our communities, because they're so under-resourced, they have been historically disinvested in, that once you add, the proliferation of guns, just like you add COVID-19, it just spreads like wildfire in those specific communities because they're most vulnerable. And so if you were to take a map of where in the city of Chicago the COVID-19 pandemic hurt people the most, it's literally the same map of where most of the shootings happen. Is literally the same map where most young people are unemployed and out of school. And so for us, that's why it's important to tackle the root causes of these issues, so that way, in the same way that, in the same way that people are under resourced, we want to make sure that we're creating the resources for our communities, so that way we can withstand the pressures that come with this disease, right, of gun violence. And so that's why it's important for us in those fronts. And then as it relates to Black and Brown unity, really our efforts at Black and Brown unity, we have been working on them for a while, but they were especially a big thing for us during the George Floyd uprisings, when we saw a lot of tension between Black and Brown communities. And immediately after the George Floyd uprisings, it was civil society in Chicago broke down. The mayor lifted the bridges to downtown, and people in Black and brown neighborhoods in the South Side were fighting with each other. And we decided, hey, we got to change the narrative. We can't be pitted against each other. We have to work collectively because we have the same issues, similar struggles, and intertwined histories in a lot of ways. And so what we did is we called some of our Black organizers in South Shore that we partnered with in a different community in Chicago, and we said, hey, what can we do? And we organized a Black and Brown Unity Car Parade within a few days of civil society breaking down completely. And we thought maybe 10, 20 cars would show up. And then like 300, 400 cars showed up with Pan-African flags, Mexican flags. And that now we're going on our 5th annual Black and Brown Unity Car Parade, which will be held this upcoming Friday. And for us, it's important because there's just a growing recognition, especially as it relates to gun violence, that Black and brown folks, and when it comes to every issue, right, that is underlying, right, housing, low-paying jobs, lack of access to education, and propensity to be victims of gun violence, Black and brown folks are disproportionately affected. And so that old saying that we cannot be free until we're all free, it is specifically true about the struggles that we face. And it's specifically true because in this system, these two communities that have been historically oppressed and under-resourced are often pitted against one another. And so because we face a lot of the same issues, then it's important for us to, especially in a city like Chicago, but anywhere else, to be fighting with one another instead of against one another, because that's the only way we're all going to be free and we're all going to be able to address some of these issues.
Very, very appreciated of this whole panel. Before we get started with questions, I want to make sure that folks know how to reach y'all. So if y'all can put your contact information in the chat, that would be greatly appreciated. But then also, if you just have, 1 or 2 words on how they can get engaged and involved in the work that you're doing specifically, or if they have any questions about gun violence in a particular part of the country, whether it's California, Chicago, the East Coast, the Southwest, places like Texas, let us know. So I'll start with you, Kim, then I'll go back to Michelle, Cuco, and Berto.
Yeah, thank you. I think, like I said, for community justice, we're always organizing. And we've got regions across the country that we focus on. I don't think there's, and this issue to a little bit about what everyone said, but specifically to Berto's point, is about advancing public health approaches to this disease of gun violence. And so this is stuff that works. It's been working for years. We have incarcerating our people has not, been the solution. It has not delivered the results that we are told that it was supposed to deliver. And so given that that's the case, right, we're always organizing, trying to push and protect these strategies that work and keep us safe. I encourage folks to reach out to me, go to our website. We need all the help that we can get, especially if you're curious about or feeling hopeless about this issue. I think that is real. I think we are made to feel like we can't do anything, and that is something that by organizing and by our campaigns, we actively dismantle because we do have the tools. It's about building our people power. Yeah, that is. I'll put all this info in the chat and stuff. But we are always looking for support, and I think the whole message around unity, we are stronger together. This is a winnable fight. There is no abyss that we're going into. We have the solutions, and I think the more that we can forge spaces where we are able to come together and say all of this and build our ecosystem for public safety, I think we win.
Thank you, Kim. Michelle,
Thank you.
quick last thoughts.
Yeah, just again, thank you. And the work we've been doing, just boots to the ground from the moment we lost our brother, because we know how important it was to get ahead of our narrative. I can't express this enough to anybody who's experienced violence. No matter what, sometimes we might think we have the media on our side, but oftentimes they do a lot more harm than we think that they should be doing some good. And again, for us, my sister and I, very grassroots from the beginning, no no organizational anything in the beginning, just again for the love of our brother, but also the love of preventing this from happening to anybody else. And and we've seen it now. It's been 4 years since our brother, and yet this department has not killed somebody. And it just takes collective work. It takes a lot of sacrifice. And it's just all this to say, like, we will see change in our time. I believe it. We are having conversations that we need, that maybe 10 years ago people were like, that's too, no, you can't be saying that. And now we're seeing these conversations we're having people come to the table. We're building partnerships all throughout, not just in California, nationwide, but specific to the ecosystem of Vallejo. Vallejo is a city that's been ignored and not invested in. So people can support our work. As I said, my sister and I just launched the Sean Monterosa project, where we're trying to build out various initiatives here in the Bay Area, but also, again, helping empower families and providing them a toolkit of how to work and prevent this from happening to their own loved ones or happening in their community, right? In both in Spanish and also in English. Again, there's no blueprint, but we've been going on this train 1,000 miles, and we've seen things work, so please use us as a vessel, I would say, of just how to navigate if something's happening in your police department. Who do you bring to the table to start carrying those conversations? And we've met so many people who are like, how do you get a street, how do you get a mural, and this is part of us reclaiming our own narratives and humanizing our loved ones. But also, this is healing to all of us. Not all of us have access to, as my sister says, Malibu retreats, right? We create our own Malibu retreats, and there's power in art and just getting connected with our indigenous medicine. Kuko emphasizes it enough. Like, I feel my brother here, and I'm sure all of us have our loved ones that we carry with us in this space, in this room. So you can follow us at the Justice for Sean Instagram. I'll put my information in the chat. But just again, don't wait till it happens to your own loved one. If you see an incident happening in your community, just show up. And you don't know how to show up, just provide a meal. If you can provide a meal, ask if they need a ride somewhere, or bring some flowers, or just be there. And just being there sometimes is all people need. So that's all I got.
Thank you, Michelle. Coco, we'll go to you.
Yeah, I think that, well, my email is in there, and I'm sure everybody on the panel will be more than happy to connect. I mean, I think that, for me, I think there's a lot of on-ramps and entry points in terms of the work. Some folks, from community people to foundations, I think a lot of us talk about the different conversations we're having with people, who, if they're funders, if they're organizations, whatever it is. I think that there's different places where people come in because, unfortunately, gun violence is a pretty broad issue. If you're doing work with suicides, if you're doing, work with homicides, work with intimate partner violence, police violence, there's just, unfortunately, this is just an overwhelming issue that has affected us multiple ways. And I think part of it is understanding what areas you want to kind of enter in terms of this work. And certainly I caution philanthropy usually because, philanthropy thinks that just because they have the money, we can do this. Like, well, no, I mean, where are you coming in? And more importantly, and I say this with all respect, but also as an equity officer, like, you have to be careful because you can actually do more harm than good in many cases. And as a person of color, as a recipient of services, as a provider of services, as a person in philanthropy, I've seen all of that. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. What we seldom see is, especially on the philanthropic side, philanthropy saying, you know what, we really screwed that one up. Like, we did a lot of harm here. I've never seen that report. And I think it's important because philanthropy in many cases has done harm. So have government agencies, so have a lot of organizations whose mission it is to help communities. I say all of that because I think that consistently what's been lacking, especially from an equity standpoint, is that, most organizations created their missions, their visions, their values, their purpose, and what they call convention at a time when we weren't represented. People of color were not represented, women were not represented, LGBTQ populations, a lot of subgroups in terms of where we are at today in the context of equity. And when these organizations were created, really are two different timeframes. And what they call convention did not include us. And many times, at best, it just didn't include us. At worst, it had some pretty horrible intentions towards our communities. And I say all of that because I think that within the conventional gun violence movement, and when we're doing this, I think that part of this conversation for us as we enter this conversation and this work, we really need to question some things that we call convention. And I think that for us, especially as Latinos or folks, we've all struggled with that, where we're coming in trying to change what was, well, it's always been this way. Well, yeah, I didn't include me, and that doesn't fit for my community. And so we continue to struggle with that. And I say that because I think that everybody needs to have that awareness when you're coming into this work, but also that it's needed. It's needed to question a lot of this because, as you talked about in terms of especially around gun violence. You talked about a public health approach. And I always give this example because I think this is very telling, that it's really a white-dominated perspective in how we want to approach gun violence that really wasn't inclusive of our communities or other communities of color, because we'd approach it differently. And the example that I give is, diabetes affects our community a lot. African American, Latino, Native people, we are impacted by that. What we haven't done is invest 99% of the resources to outlaw sugar. What we did is we said, we can't do that, but really we should focus on helping people change behaviors, informing. We developed a lot of other strategies. But, nationally for gun violence, a large 90% of the resources are going towards policy change that, if we're honest, has had some negative impacts on communities of color in terms of criminalization. And what we haven't supported, and now this movement is starting to shift, is really having to do the hard work on the ground in communities and changing the mindset. And I think, as Michelle said, really looking at, the impact on communities in terms of trauma and healing. The fact that we have to shift the perspective of communities, especially young men in communities of color, that it is an option, or that the appropriate way to resolve internal or external conflict is by taking your life or the life of someone else's. We've so normalized that. And that's the really hard work. So yes, it is about access to firearms, and we need to talk about that. But we also need to talk about changing that internalization and the fact that we've so normalized the devaluing of life, especially our own and those people that look like ourselves. That's a really deep-rooted challenge that we have that has been internalized in our communities for over 500 years, and we need to talk about. And so I say all of that because I think that even the way that we've approached this issue of gun violence has been really done through a very different lens. And now it's beginning to include our perspective and our approaches. And I think that a lot more of that needs to happen. So I would urge folks to get involved, but I would also urge folks to come in and disrupt the way that we've been doing this, and also to make sure that you value what you do know about your community. Just because you haven't done gun violence work doesn't mean you don't understand the community you live in and you survive in and you live with. And you bring a great deal of that expertise to this conversation.
Thank you, Coco. And Berto, we have a little bit of time left, so just quick words, and then I see a question.
Gotcha. I'll make it brief. So what I would say is, and maybe the organizers will appreciate this, but I do think that it's one relationship at a time, right? One conversation at a time. The biggest impediment to social change, the biggest impediment to driving systemic change in the gun violence prevention space is a disconnected people, right? And disconnected organizations. And so that the way that you can really drive change is, I always say, like, the shortest distance between two people is just exchanging a story. That could be done over a meal, that could be done over coffee, over a Zoom, over a panel. And that's what I would encourage folks to do, to find their people in their community, however they define that, build relationships, exchange stories, and decide on a common objective that fits their context and their history.
Amazing, thank you. And one of the questions from our folks is, how do we work together to prevent suicide, or to help prevent suicide? I can start, and then I can, move it off to anybody else who wants to answer. One, I think, our communities have a stigma around mental health, right? Oftentimes in our communities, when we think about seeing a therapist, or when we think about getting support for mental and emotional anguish, people say that, oh, okay, yo no estoy loco, I'm not crazy, or it's not something that, I want to do, or they turn to faith. And while faith is one component of that healing journey, I will never, I'll never say that faith isn't. There are multiple tools in the toolbox that can also support in that healing journey when it comes to mental and emotional health. And so, I would recommend, having conversations about finding some of those therapeutic measures and interventions, supporting folks in their mental and emotional journey, and also starting, from where they are. If they, don't want to see a therapist, then maybe they can see their pastor, their priest, their cura, their santero, their babalao, right? Or they can see a healer in their community. If they are folks who are interested in going to ceremonia or círculo and sitting in círculo, those are other ways that you can tap into some of that collective knowledge and medicine as well. But then also, normalizing that, depression can be real, and part of, the reality of suicide is that our folks feel mental and emotional anguish, and finding those outlets for our folks to be able to process some of that pain and trauma and get the supports that they need. Anybody else have any other thoughts around fighting depression? Fighting gun suicide.
I can talk briefly, just because that was part of the work that I did in mental health. I would say that there's a lot of strategies already, at least I'll point for California, pertain to Latino communities, specifically to the things that you talked about, and more than happy to connect you with some folks that have been doing that for a long time. Maybe not specifically on gun violence, but certainly around suicide, that accounts for a lot of these differences. Like you said, Jose, not all communities are at the same place around stigma in terms of mental health, but there's been a lot of strategies that have been developed in certainly in California that I'm familiar with, that have helped bridge that gap so that folks can get connected to formal mental health systems. More than happy to share that if my email's there, and I can connect folks with that.
All right, friends. So this is the end of our panel. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to any of our panelists. They are more than willing and excited to support and help. And we're really looking forward to seeing you get engaged and getting involved, having these conversations, and also thinking about gun violence in more diverse ways, right? Whether we think about city gun violence or everyday gun violence, whether we think about gun suicide, violence against women, police violence, violence against our LGBTQ friends and family as well, hate-motivated violence. There are a number of different ways that this shows up in our communities, and we are impacted by each and every one of these. So we're very grateful and glad that we got to hear from these panelists, and we're grateful and glad that you were able to show your support and participate today. Thank you all. Be well.